Yeah, just one thing. Sometimes I get very enthusiastic and I start speaking very quickly. So if I'm speaking too quickly for you to understand, please just stop me or slow me down. Just let me know. And yeah, thank you for speaking such good English, because my Finnish is horrible. Kiitos. The very fact that we have to have a talk about whether or not anarchy works, about whether or not anarchist forms of organization can function in practice, is evidence of a very profound, intense, and long-standing process of colonization, genocide, repression, and the disappearance of historical memory, the disappearance of our collective memories. Because the vast majority of human history has been anarchic, has been stateless, has been based in self-organization. Cheers. So really talks like these shouldn't even be necessary. They're only necessary because states around the world have constantly engaged in the process of destroying any other way of organizing our lives, destroying all forms of horizontal, non-hierarchical, communal or collective organization, and then afterwards destroying the memory, or altering, corrupting the memory that these things even existed. So I think that's an important starting point. The fact that this conversation isn't happening on a level playing field. It's not happening on an even ground. These are things that on the one hand should be obvious, but on the other hand are buried under really millennia of state propaganda of various kinds. Another interesting point that this fact brings to the fore is that, as most of you probably know, the anarchist movement as such arose only in the last centuries, whereas if I'm referring to millennia and millennia of self-organization and statelessness in human history, I'm also, of course, referring to many examples that never called themselves anarchists. That for me is an important point an important element of anarchism, is at least in theory, it's intended to be non-dogmatic. It's intended to be open to many forms of participation. It doesn't matter whether or not people identify as anarchists. It doesn't matter whether or not people are participating directly in some kind of movement if they define themselves one way or another. The point is to create societies with no hierarchy, with no exploitation, with no oppression. So we're not trying to recruit people to the anarchist party, which also means that we can learn from, we can take inspiration from examples that are not anarchist, as long as they're anti-authoritarian, as long as they reject all forms of exploitation, authority, and oppression, as long as they're against capitalism, against the state, against patriarchy, against colonialism. So we can learn from really the whole diversity of human experience without needing to place our label on specific experiences. The book Anarchy Works has close to 100 examples of anarchy in practice, from a long time ago, from recently, examples that still exist, examples from most continents. Only about a third of these examples are explicitly anarchist, identified with the anarchist movement. So most of these examples are not anarchist, but they are anarchic. They are anti-authoritarian, communal, maybe other examples from some anti-capitalist movement that didn't specifically identify as anarchist, maybe non-Western peoples or non-Western nations fighting against colonialism, peoples who never traditionally had a state and are fighting against state authority, of course without needing to identify themselves with the anarchist movement. And so those are things that I think it's also very important to learn from. But well, as a sign of respect and of solidarity, of course, it's important not to place the anarchist label on movements or on cultures that didn't identify as anarchist. So I want to be very clear that, in fact, most of the things that I'll be talking about were either heterogeneous, so only partially anarchist, or not explicitly anarchist. Just so no one gets the idea that I'm saying that all of these different examples are, form a part of the anarchist movement. I want to start with some more classic examples that are attached or are connected in some way to the anarchist movement because they had an important, strong anarchist participation, even if, of course, none of these movements were homogenously anarchist. First, I'm going to name these and then go back into to talk in more detail about some of the best-known examples. A lot of you will already know of these examples. Some of you might not, but it's just good to establish that there is this pretty deeply rooted anarchist history out there with a lot of examples to learn from. And again, after each of these different groups of examples, I want to go back and talk about the problems, because obviously we don't live in an anarchist world today. So if, on the one hand, I'm arguing that anarchy works and that these examples of anarchy in practice worked, but on the other hand, clearly we live under a capitalist statist regime, there's a disconnect there. If it works, why haven't we had the revolution yet? I certainly don't want to selling anyone a bridge is an American expression. I don't want to sell anyone any false ideas or easy solutions that, just believe anarchy is very simple and then we'll have the revolution and everything will be better. All of these struggles experienced lots of difficulties. All of these struggles had lots of internal problems. All of these examples were imperfect, but they were learning processes. And if we include them in our collective memory, then they constitute forms of wisdom, forms of knowledge that can help keep us from having to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. Anarchy is possible, but it's not easy, especially since the state is dedicated to crushing any example of anarchy, any example of freedom that arises. It's not an easy proposition. In fact, in general, I would say that anarchist movements have tended to avoid and to even denounce all of these easy solutions that are offered, right? Vote for a new political party and everything will be better. You won't have austerity. Get a job at a better company and your problems will be solved. Buy the right products and you'll be happy. Participate in this union and we'll make sure that your labor conditions are dignified. In general, anarchists don't offer these easy solutions, and to be honest, it's a question of decades, not generations and generations of struggle, which we very may never win. But it's based on the idea that a life spent fighting for freedom, even if you never reach that final goal, is much better than a life submitting to authority, accepting injustice, accepting oppression. So, at the end of each of these groups of examples, I'm just going to go into what some of the problems were and what the problems weren't, just to at least give my view of what the real problems are. Because typically we're trained to think, well, anarchy, if it's going to fail, if it doesn't work, it's because of human nature, because we're naturally selfish. It's because once society grows large and complex, it's impossible to self-organize. Anarchy is just, it's poorly organized, it's inefficient. I would argue that any serious look at history disproves all of these arguments, but there are other problems, other difficulties in anarchist struggles, or in really any struggle for total freedom that come up again and again and again. And I think we need to be aware of those. So I didn't write this book to make people feel really good and optimistic and like, freedom is just around the corner, but in the hopes of helping people think about struggle, helping people think about what sort of methods and strategies they need to be adopting in their own lives to take on these great problems of oppression, exploitation, and authority. So there have been, in fact, a number of examples within anti-capitalist movements around the world in which people were able to temporarily overthrow state power and self-organize, sometimes within very large areas. The main examples that I'm going to mention, at least briefly, are one that's actually not very well known, is a general strike that was organized in Seattle in 1919 with participation of diverse labor unions, from more reformist labor unions to more radical anarchist labor unions like the Walking, the IWW. So in fact, they had kicked out state authorities in the city of Seattle, the entire city, for a month. And in the beginning, also, the state thought that if they also just let them run things on their own, it would quickly collapse and people would just be begging the government, the police and all that, to come rushing back in and save them, and that didn't happen. In fact, the general of the US Army, because of course the army was mobilized in case they had to repress this uprising by force, slaughtering dozens or hundreds of people, which is something which has of course happened many, many times in the history of every single democratic government in the world. The general in charge of this, the military force that was sort of besieging this sort of liberated Seattle, making sure that it didn't spread, visited the city, and when he was writing about it, he wrote that he was shocked to find how well organized everything was, without police, without the government, with worker self-organization, and he was really surprised by that. Now that unfortunately ended after the larger unions, the more bureaucratic unions, came to a deal for some small reform, which of course didn't end capitalism and just gave the bosses in the end more time to reorganize capitalism. Sure, it won better conditions in the short term for workers, but not even in the long term, in the medium term, it's very, very easy just to raise prices or to change other conditions within the capitalist economy, so that all of these gains in working conditions that we might win through more reformist methods don't really pay off. They don't affect capitalist profit margins too much in the end. So we can maybe win higher wages, but then we just have higher living expenses, or maybe the jobs get sent somewhere else, and then they just encourage nationalistic movements which blame immigrants, blame foreign countries, etc. There's the example of the Makhnovshchina. There was a large part of Ukraine during the Russian Revolution and the Russian Civil War, which had a majority anarchist influence, and this was a liberated area during different periods of time when it was liberated, and then different periods of time when it was occupied either by the White Army or by the Red Army. But they had autonomous periods lasting up to 6 months in a region comprising 7 million people, mostly peasants, who collectivized or communalized agriculture, who kicked out the owning class, and who also organized their own military units to fight against the White Army, which was trying to suppress the revolution. They also had early successes against the German Imperial Army, because of course Lenin in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk just generously gave Ukraine over to the German Empire. So it was actually peasants organizing themselves who successfully defeated, in a large part of Ukraine, the nationalist Ukrainian forces and then the German Imperial Army. Then they later, at times, allied with the Red Army because they were in favor of an anti-capitalist revolution. At other times, they fought against the Red Army. And they also won some of the most decisive victories against the White Army at times when first Denikin and later Wrangel were on the point of crushing that revolution. So they actually showed quite a high capacity for armed self-defense, for fighting against these much, much larger, hierarchically organized armies. So the Revolutionary Insurgent Army, as the anarchist forces were called, succeeded in defeating the White Army occupation of that region of Ukraine. And then eventually they came again into conflict with the Red Army because the Leninists kept trying to arrest all the anarchist organizers to monopolize the course of the revolution, which obviously led to conflict. They started arresting you. It's sort of hard to be allies, suppressing the anarchist press, suppressing the anarchist organizations, etc. So then there was a period of conflict again with the Red Army, in which actually the anarchists were able to encourage many mass desertions from the Red Army, because people who were fighting supposedly for the revolution within the Red Army had lots of opportunities to learn what exactly the Leninists meant by revolution, how authoritarian and how oppressive their style of revolution was. So they were able to deliver a number of setbacks to the Red Army in that period, and then when Wrangel took Crimea and the White Army appeared to be a threat again, they once again allied with the Red Army. And immediately after the defeat, in which the anarchists played a crucial role of Wrangel's forces, the Red Army, the Bolsheviks, in a surprise move, arrested and executed a large number of the anarchists. So that's, at that point, it was basically over. That was their downfall, and they basically fled, went into exile, or were killed. So that's basically the reason why that experiment in anarchy failed in the long term, when it was crushed. Militarily, I think that they did quite well against their opponents, but they were much smaller. They failed to spread to other regions, and they were betrayed ultimately by more authoritarian revolutionaries and stabbed in the back. There's the example of the Xinmin province in Manchuria, in which there were a couple million Korean immigrants organized in the Korean Anarchist Communist Federation. There's much fewer materials in English about this, but actually I've learned recently that there's some of the old historical materials from Korean are getting translated, some into English, some into Spanish. So pretty soon there will be a lot more information about this, but it seems to be a case very similar to Machnoshina in Ukraine, where you had a large area that included cities and countryside that was self-organized by the workers, by the peasants, by the people living there, with large anarchist participation, and they also fought in this politically very complex situation in which you had the Imperial Japanese Army trying to dominate the area, you had the Red Army from the Soviet Union in the mix, and then also the Red Army from China, all of them trying to dominate this area. This was basically in the years just prior to World War II. But yeah, at the moment there's much less information available about that, but we know that this was another experiment in self-organization involving millions of people, that for a couple years they held out against all of these three much larger armies that were trying to dominate them. And then in the end, I think it was actually Japanese imperial agents who assassinated one of their most important military strategists, and after that different factions conquered it and divided it up. So that again shows how in these revolutionary struggles, as far as attempts at self-organization go, though on the ground there was very little difference between the authoritarian revolutionaries and the reactionaries, like the Japanese fascists, essentially. Then, of course, the best known is the Spanish Civil War. There's lots of materials about this, about collectivizations there. This was one of the most important battles against fascism, of course, because you had a military coup by fascists in the Spanish state in 1936, and then on the anti-fascist side, you had socialists, you had communists, and you had anarchists. And the anarchists at the beginning were the majoritarian force in large parts of Spain, in Catalonia, in Aragon, in a lot of Valencia, a lot of Andalusia. And in the beginning, the communists were the smallest part, but because the Soviet Union was basically the only country supporting this, they soon grew to basically take over all of the statist factions, using the fact that they were the only ones who were controlling the influx of support of weapons and so forth. And so actually, it was, I think it's most accurate to assert that it wasn't the fascists who destroyed the revolution in Spain, but it was the communists, because by the time the fascists won the war, really, by 1938, the end was already very evident, even though it didn't end officially until 1939. At that point, there really were no more revolutionary initiatives in Spain. Self-organization had been crushed, the communists had been crushed. In fact, the International Brigades were used by the Stalinists to crush a number of these collectives in the countryside. But in the beginning, especially in the first half year, through a large part of Spain, millions of peasants in the countryside abolished private property and established either collectives or communes, organizing themselves, feeding themselves, taking in refugees from the fascist areas, sending food and other materials to the front to support the militias and the armies. You had factories and workplaces in the cities being collectivized, and of course Catalonia was industrially the most advanced area in the Spanish state, and many of these industries were self-organized. And that wasn't a problem. There weren't major failings of self-organization. The self-organization worked. The peasants and the workers, they knew how to organize what they already did anyways in their day-to-day life. And in fact, there's plenty of studies and plenty of accounts about how many of these different functions improved when they were self-organized by the workers or by the peasants. The peasants were able to erase a lot of the inequalities in terms of food distribution, increase the level of food production. Healthcare in Catalonia, for example, where the healthcare system was collectivized by the workers, healthcare was expanded, and very rural areas that previously didn't have access to healthcare, they got new hospitals and new clinics. Public transportation was also increased and made more accessible by creating conflicts. Because if they're expropriating the bourgeoisie, if they're kicking out the rich people, if they're organizing things on their own, that's going to create too many conflicts, and then we won't be unified fighting the fascists. But for the communists, being unified to fight against the fascists basically meant suppressing these more revolutionary movements so that they could kill off a lot of their opponents. It's kind of sad to admit, because there's a lot of sort of romantic history about the International Brigades, right? I mean, it was sort of a romantic moment in a way. From all across the world, people went to Spain to fight against fascism, volunteering, putting their lives on the line with the hopes that if fascism could be defeated in Spain, then this world war that was brewing could be averted. And people did this on their own because, of course, all the democratic countries, Great Britain, the US, France, weren't supporting the anti-fascist side in Spain, and in fact, in some ways, clandestinely, they were supporting the fascists because they were much more afraid of an anti-capitalist revolution than they were of fascism. But in reality, the Stalinists controlled the International Brigades, and they used the International Brigades to kill off a lot of dissident communists, like more Trotskyists or counter-communists, as well as anarchists. So they would, get all of the non-Stalinist communists from France, from Belgium, from Poland, etc., to go there to a war situation where it was very easy for them to be killed off. They also used the International Brigades to crush anarchist communes in Aragon and in Catalonia, in the countryside. So that's a history that, on the one hand, is extremely inspiring, because about half a year, in huge swaths of the country, involving millions of people self-organized their lives. They erased these inequalities. They ensured themselves access to healthcare, to education, to public transportation, to food. They experimented with different ways of organizing, because some of these, for example, in the countryside, some of these were organized as collectives, others as communes. Some places, for example, established alternative currencies, where each village would sort of issue a currency, and everyone in the village would get the same amount. To ensure that they could meet all of their basic needs, and then people could sort of choose how to spend this. And other villages, villages and towns organized libertarian communism or anarchist communism, where they abolished money and everything was free. Everything that they made, everything that they grew and that they produced was simply put in a communal storehouse, and all you had to do, you just went in, you wrote down what you took, and you could take whatever you want. Because they abolished this capitalist idea of scarcity and made it very clear that as long as people are self-organizing, as long as the capitalists, as long as we get rid of this class of capitalist parasites, of middlemen and all the rest, there is actually abundance. There's enough for everybody. And so people could just go in and take what they wanted and just write it down. And this worked. It didn't fall apart because people got selfish and they started hoarding things, or people stopped working because they had enough and there was no pressure, there was no economic pressure on them to work, like this typical capitalist blackmail, that you either work or you starve, or sometimes you work and you starve. That wasn't the problem. The problem was supposed revolutionary allies kept saying that if you keep rocking the boat like this and upset our middle class and our bourgeois allies, then the fascists will win. And they used various methods, even going up to armed repression. In other words, invading and shooting people in these collectives. That's what put this. That's what ended this experiment in communism, or libertarian communism. But yeah, like I said, there's that's probably the best studied example, at least in European languages. There's a lot available. And then one more recent example is the rebellion in Oaxaca in 2006. Oaxaca is a state in southern Mexico. Anarchist participation there was definitely only from a minority, but there were also very important indigenous perspectives in that movement, because Oaxaca is one of the states of Mexico with the highest indigenous population, and a lot of these indigenous cultures were either traditionally stateless or had traditionally more anti-authoritarian horizontal organizing methods, lots of traditions of villages making decisions in common assemblies in which everyone participated, and so forth. That started in 2006 with a strike by the teachers' union, which was going on strike every year. They would have an encampment, a protest encampment, but this year the police attacked, and in response to that, people rioted, they rebelled, and they managed to kick the police out of the city. And this movement quickly spread beyond the issue of teachers and public service workers to include all the aspects of life. Police and government representatives were kicked out of not only Oaxaca City, but a large part of the state of Oaxaca. And that lasted for about 5 months, in which people were self-organizing. There's a lot of interesting accounts of people who participated about how the barricades served as a very important point of organization. In the beginning, people in each neighborhood had collectively built barricades, and they had to stay on those barricades a long time because police and paramilitaries kept coming back, attacking people, killing people, trying to repress this rebellion. And so the barricades became meeting points, places also for the creation of sort of new liberated culture, because also you had, for example, artists participating, and they would do things to decorate the barricades or to redecorate that area. Assemblies for the organization of daily life, and so forth. In this period, in general, for large parts of Oaxaca, the police and the courts, they weren't functioning, right? They'd been kicked out. In fact, there are lots of cases of the courts and the jail, the authorities offering people who were locked up in the jails to let them go if they would go into the liberated areas and attack people, steal things, and do these other crimes or forms of harming other people, which we're trained to believe will be the result of anarchy, right? If we don't have police, if we don't have the government, everyone's just going to go wild and start shooting each other and raping each other and killing each other and stealing things because there's no punishment, there's no consequences, right? And it's such a cynical view of human nature. It's as though the only reason that I'm not killing someone right here is because, I really want to kill you. Just, I like your shoes. I'm going to take your shoes, so I'll just kill you, but crap, if I do that, then I might go to prison. So I guess I'm not going to kill you as though this would ever enter my head. I think that actually says a lot about the people who are in charge, right? Because psychologically you tend to project on the other people what's in your own head. So I think that says a lot about judges and cops and politicians, but not about the rest of us. This didn't happen in Oaxaca. There weren't killing sprees. Actually, the only people going on killing sprees were the police and the paramilitaries. Pretty much all of the deaths, the violent deaths that occurred in Oaxaca in this period were caused by paramilitaries and by police. So once again, this is a very direct example of this projection that I was just talking about. They're the ones who go rampaging, who steal whatever they can get away with, who kill whomever they can get away with. And when we're not talking about periods of rebellion, they do this in a much quieter, institutionalized, structural way, without having to do it with guns, but doing it with policies, with structural readjustment, with austerity, and so forth. So that lasted for 5 months. There's also, interesting examples of specifically how they organized sort of like neighborhood watch volunteers with a tradition that actually it was originally an indigenous tradition. So people who would walk around neighborhoods, and if there was some kind of problem, like if there was some assault going on, or if like a normal person was getting robbed or something like that, they would call on the neighbors and intervene that way to help people protect themselves, rather than having some professional person with a gun who has this privilege of being able to kill or arrest other people they didn't have like the sort of privileged caste of law enforcers. So yeah, that would be interesting to go into in more detail, like all these examples would, but of course we don't have time to talk about everything. Why did that end after 5 months? After 5 months, the Mexican state decided to send in the military, and so the movement was faced with a very, very difficult decision, whether to resist the military or whether to take down the barricades. It's definitely not a decision that I envy them, and it would be hard to criticize them for making the right decision or the wrong decision. But one thing that I think is true from talking to people who participated, from reading accounts, reading critiques of the grassroots participants, is all the different assemblies that had risen up that had appeared to assist in this giant task of self-organization, basically had consolidated into one giant assembly, and different political factions from the left, like all these different little parties, the Trotskyists, the Stalinists, and so forth, have been fighting for control of the assembly. So instead of just letting the APO, the larger assembly, be an open space that basically people from the grassroots could use to help themselves in their daily organizing activities, they saw this as sort of a place for the creation of centralized power, and so they've been fighting over it and have basically been able to a large extent, institutionalize that space and make it more a space of professional representatives from these different political organizations rather than a space of free organization. And by a lot of accounts, they prevented a sort of free movement-wide debate about how to resist, how to continue the struggle. And one common characteristic of these more hierarchical authoritarian groups that arise from social movements is they recognize that a sure path to power is through negotiations, right? So in the beginning, they'll support more radical tactics that create some kind of crisis of governance, that participate in a rebellion, force the existing powers to negotiate because the pre-existing order has been upset, and then once there's an offer for negotiations, they try to exert control of the movement, pacify the movement, and represent it, speak for it, go to the negotiating table, and then get into power. And that's certainly what at least some people did in Oaxaca. So it certainly isn't a sure thing that the rebellion would have turned into a revolution and spread. It's very possible that if they hadn't taken down the barricades, they'd have been massacred. But in this case, we don't know what would have happened. So what are some of the common characteristics of these different rebellions? First of all, what weren't their problems? What weren't their fatal weaknesses? I don't really think that an honest look at these different histories would support the idea that self-organization imposed some limit on these movements. In general, they didn't have problems with self-organization. They didn't have problems. Of course, there's always problems, right? Anyone who's participated in a self-organized project knows that there's problems, there's conflicts, but these are ways that you learn. These are ways that the group gets more intelligent. These are the ways that that you figure out how to do it better. So it would be more realistic to say that the constant problems with self-organization were constantly surpassed, allowing ever higher levels of self-organization and more efficient self-organization. But that wasn't what led to the failure of these movements. These movements didn't collapse because they decided to opt for self-organization. What caused the failure of each of these movements was either repression by the state in cases when these movements were isolated. That's been a common characteristic. Perhaps we just have perpetually bad timing, because typically these movements are sorely outnumbered because they happen in one place and not in others, right? Like what would have been the situation if the rebellion, the revolution that broke out in Spain in 1936 had also broken out in France, in Portugal, in Germany, but typically they've been happening in a very isolated way that make them easier to become outnumbered. And the state has these very strong capacities of repression. But I would argue that that's not a reason to give up on the anarchist project or any other project of total liberation, whether or not it's labeled as anarchist, but to support it even more. Because we're recognizing that really the only thing standing between us and total freedom, the ability of everyone to participate in the organization of their own lives and have influence over their surroundings, instead of living in what's essentially a very large, shiny, open-air prison, in which the only thing we're allowed to do is consume and vote, is the violence of the state. Right? That in the end is the fundamental argument for authoritarian organization. It's the fact that if you struggle to the final consequences, eventually you have a gun against your head. That may be a little bit less evident in social welfare states in Scandinavia, but it's certainly no less true. And of course, the growing way in which the democratic government here is taking advantage of fascist movements, for example, or indirectly killing people by through their border policies. Should, I think, leave no room for illusions about what this same government would do if there actually were strong revolutionary social movements here capable of threatening power. And then the other common problem was, of course, authoritarian tendencies within these same rebellious movements. Tendencies that identify the vehicle for liberation as the state. Right, so if you truly think that the only way for us to liberate ourselves is through the state, well then you have to be able to control the state before you can affect change. But if you want to control the state is a centralizing structure, right? It's not a structure of open participation like an assembly is. And so you need to first of all make sure that other people don't have that control. You need to first of all suppress other potential competitors. Once you start doing that, then you enter into conflict with them, and then they become your enemies, and then you're on this path where you can never do anything because you're constantly surrounded by enemies, and then revolution just becomes a synonym for suppressing everyone who doesn't agree that you are right. But yeah, in all these cases, there's examples of authoritarian elements within the movements themselves that betray and suppress other elements, and use the same tactics that the right wing does. Which is why many anarchists don't identify as being part of the left, because of this history of the left often being another, even if many people at the base of the left are sincere, in the leadership positions they often use a lot of the same tactics, sometimes more intelligently even than the right. I want to talk about some non-anarchist examples. I'll have to do it a little bit quicker, or we'll be here all night. Let's see. I might have to cut some of these out. All right, so there's one nation that lives in Africa, in Central Africa, traditionally in the Ituri forest, are called the Mbuti, and they're not anarchists, but they've traditionally lived without a state. According to their oral histories, they've been living in the Ituri forest since the beginning of time, and it's definitely they've definitely been there a very long time. Even like Roman accounts from the Roman Empire mention them. They traditionally don't have states. They're also very interesting because they also don't have traditionally two of these forms of hierarchy, which we can also find in some societies that don't have states and that don't have capitalism, which would be patriarchy and age hierarchies. In Mbuti languages, Mbuti language, for example, they don't make a lot of gender distinctions, like brother, sister would just be sibling, or daughter, son. They tend not to use gendered language. They also have a lot of rituals, which I think even like in Western society could have a lot of appeal in queer movements. For example, they had something between like a ritual and a game where all the people who would be defined as men are on one side, all the people and women on the other side, and they start playing a game of tug of war. But as soon as one side starts winning, then someone from that side changes their gender and runs to the other side and starts pulling on the other side. And anytime like that side starts winning, then the same thing happens. And they keep playing until everyone has changed their gender multiple times, and they've basically ridiculed the whole concept and also created an important metaphor for balance rather than exploitation. Because the whole purpose is that you're playing tug of war, but that no side wins. And then as far as age goes, they have 5 different age classes traditionally, and each of these age classes has autonomy, right? So besides the infants who their job is basically just to grow and to eat and stuff like that. But then the age class of children in the Mapute are traditionally nomadic, but they would establish camps for usually a day or a couple of days. And in each of these camps there would be a separate children's camp. And there the children are in charge, and their job is basically to play and to learn and to grow. And also, their games are traditionally not competitive games, but cooperative games. And if adults go into the children's camp, they get ridiculed, and the children kick out the adults. So they actually have power within that space. And it's also up to the individual to decide when they go from one age class to another, right? So that instead of having like this hierarchical age system, they actually have like a system based on autonomy and self-identification. That's the tradition, but there's definitely one problematic tendency in the West, is we either tend to ignore non-white cultures, non-Western cultures, or if we make any kind of, if we approach them theoretically in any way, it's also in a very exploitive way, right? We can talk about a certain intellectual colonialism. Western companies will go to colonized lands and exploit their resources, and then Western intellectuals will sort of study these different cultures as anthropologists or sociologists or what have you. Also studying maybe their traditional medicines and then patenting the plants that these medicines come from. And that's obviously just another form of exploitation of colonization. And anarchists also can be perfectly guilty of that by looking at these sort of timeless, ahistorical, romanticized visions of other peoples to confirm anarchist beliefs, right? In Mabuti, they're not anarchists. They had the opportunity to identify with an anarchist movement. They're people just like us, and they, on the whole, haven't done that. So it wouldn't be fair to classify them that way. Also, it's important not to romanticize them or to like ignore facts that might be uncomfortable for us. For example, I've seen some pamphlets produced by Western radicals that use the example of the Mabuti as like a vegan society, which actually isn't true. In fact, they kill animals, and there's also like games in the Mabuti that involve like hunting elephants and they eat meat. So it's they don't correspond to our desires of like the ideal society, because that's not their responsibility. And it's also important to talk about what's their situation now, right? If we're going to refer to them and learn from them in some ways, there should be some sort of reciprocity rather than just like a one-way take. I've been talking about how the Mabuti live traditionally, because that's not necessarily the case now, because they're undergoing a process of genocide. They exist under the danger of disappearance, because the Ituri forest is being cut down because of wars between the neighboring states in that region, like Congo and Rwanda. And in fact, one of the major threats is coltan mining for cell phone production. So the fact that people in the global north need to have like a new fancy cell phone every year, those industries need a whole lot of coltan, and a lot of that is found on Mabute lands. So miners will come in from outside, destroy the forests, kill off all the animals that the Mabute need to live, that they traditionally hunt. So they're struggling for their survival. So it would be a little bit insincere of us to just sort of paint this romanticized picture and intellectually exploit them without at least opening the possibility of solidarity. Another people from Africa, from Western Africa, the Igbo, traditionally before colonization had a very interesting ritual as far as gender is concerned. Unlike the Mbuti, they didn't have as much gender mixing. They recognized different gender groups, but instead of creating a hierarchy between those, they established autonomy, where within the economy, within the activities of daily life, the forms of feeding themselves and so forth, there were some activities that were considered women's space or women's sphere, some activities that were considered men's space. But they had a very interesting ritual to defend this autonomy, or rather the Igbo women did, which they refer to as sitting on a man. So if a man was ever violating women's autonomy, or like taking over an activity that was women's activity, or if a man was ever mistreating a woman, being abusive, hitting a woman or anything like that, then the women had a form of collective organization to basically go in and attack this man and put him in his place, and they call it sitting on a man. It would involve, at the basic levels, going to where this man lived and just going and shouting and insulting him, trying to humiliate him, making him come out and apologize and make things right. If it was very, very grave, very big problem what he had done, or if he refused to come out and to apologize and to make amends, they would increase the level, shouting louder, insulting more, and even start destroying his house using property destruction. And in some cases, they would even drag him out of his house and beat him up. And it was considered like a completely legitimate ritual within Igbo society, and the other men, it was very well known, it was widely known that the other men shouldn't intervene. But if the women are doing this, they need to back off and let them do that. Why did this end? Because often in the West, we have this view of other cultures, being very sexist, and we're very self-righteous. Yes, we have kind of gender equality here, and these other traditional cultures are very backwards. Often that's not the case, and when there is gender inequalities in other societies, often it's actually a result of colonialism. The British colonized the Igbo lands, and very, very quickly they started behaving very, very badly. They didn't respect women's autonomy. They were acting very abusively. And so Igbo women organized a massive sitting on a man against the British, involving thousands and thousands of women, and they marched to the capital of the British administration, basically in an insurrection. The British treated it as an insurrection, and they opened fire. And so they basically repressed that ritual with brute force, killing lots of people. And so we can imagine, if that's just the beginning of British colonization, and all the years since then, colonialization and neo-colonialization, what has been the effects, the impacts on gender relations in Igbo society. The Diné in the southwestern part of North America, traditionally usually referred to by white people, by Europeans as the Navajo, didn't traditionally have police forces or judges. They had community resolution methods where if there was some kind of conflict in the community, because they didn't have law codes either, right? So they didn't have crimes. The whole concept of crime is very problematic, because the problem with the crime isn't that you hurt someone else, it's that you've disobeyed the state. You've done something that says on a piece of paper that you shouldn't do. And we're not the ones who wrote the piece of paper, people in authority did. So the fundamental problem is that we're disobeying, we're being disobedient. So the emphasis isn't put on harm. It's not about whether or not we hurt someone else. It's not about if we're taking care of each other or if we're respecting each other. It's about not obeying the state. Therefore, you can have law codes in which a large part of the crimes are either harmless activities or maybe they're very good things. Like if you're hungry, taking some food. This is a good thing, right? In certain societies, they might call that theft, which is a crime. So we can't talk about crime, but we can talk about harm. Traditionally, in Indigenous society, when there was an activity that, or some kind of action that harmed someone else, it was addressed as a community problem, not as the action of some criminal who's a bad person and broke this law, but a community problem. If one person in the community harms someone else, that's because relationships between everybody are weak. It's not one person's problem, it's everybody's problem. If our relationships were healthy, then this wouldn't have happened, right? So maybe we have a conflict, right? I tried to take your shoes that I like so much, and then a fight breaks out. This isn't just a problem that I'm just like a big jerk, which maybe is also true. But it's the fact, maybe, well, why don't I have nice shoes? Like, maybe, things haven't been shared equitably in our community. Maybe it's also a problem that, the rest of you were just sort of, watching or even, laughing or fight, and, encouraging this rather than, trying to calm things down. So it's addressed at every moment as a community problem and not some individual problem, which is, the result of, one person being a bad person. And this is, I guess it's sort of weird or complex to talk about this. The typical assumption in the West is that this is just an impractical example, right? And this view, this sort of dismissal is infused with racism, right? Why isn't this a good example? Why can't we learn from this? Because, these aren't white people with a complex, scientific, advanced, civilized society. These are, these are savages, and that, you know, it's important to out that racism, to be very clear that the reason that we don't constantly try to, you know, engage in this learning process is because of this racism that constantly teaches us, you know, it's a form of separation, right? Never look outside of Western society because all these people are inferior, and that's really it's a form of creating a kind of cultural prison, right? That's one of the ways that the colonization process that happened, that created white people as a concept, perpetuates itself. Right? You know, we're just tricked into thinking that our horrible ways of doing things are superior, and so then we never engage in these acts of rebellion and disobedience, which were very, very common in the early years of colonialism. Right? In the first centuries of colonialism, one of the most common things was poor people from this entity called Europe they would run away. They would join non-white peoples in resistance against colonization because they didn't consider themselves white. The white identity hadn't been established yet. So this racism is extremely important for keeping us obedient to the state, keeping us from acting in direct solidarity with other cultures, and from abandoning this project of whiteness. In this case, we should struggle alongside them for their liberation. No, they're just only taking things and then plugging it into the colonizing system. The next four things I'm going to try to mention really, really briefly. There's the Mapuche, another indigenous nation in South Africa. They were never successfully colonized by European power, right? And that's interesting to contrast with the Inca or with the Maya, who were hierarchical civilizations in those same areas, which were very quickly conquered by the Spanish. The Mapuche were never conquered by the Spanish. Mapuche lands became known as the Spanish graveyard because this decentralized, non-authoritarian peoples resisted much more effectively. And that breaks a common myth that if we don't have a state, we can't protect ourselves. Typically, throughout the colonization process in the Americas, it was the decentralized peoples who were able to resist most effectively, whereas the empires that had arisen, the states that existed in the Americas, were crushed and absorbed most easily. That's something that you can look into more if you're interested, but I just wanted to mention that briefly. Organization, scale. There's the case of the Six Nations, the Haudenosaunee, which the colonizers named the Iroquois. So some of you might know them. There are actually 6 different indigenous nations, like the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, who live in like the northeastern part of North America. Like their traditional territory was like in the area of like between New York City and Montreal, basically. So there are 6 different nations who came together. If I'm not mistaken, around the year 1100 or 1200, and they created a federation between these 6 different nations, each of which spoke a different language. And they did that to basically come to peace and also create the possibility for coordination. And that they actually succeeded in creating peace between these 6 different peoples until the very, very heavy conflicts that arose during the colonization and genocide process. And for example, at the time of what's referred to as the American Revolution, when the American colonists were fighting against the British, and then right before that, the war between the English and the French, in which they faced a very difficult choice of which European power to ally with to slow this process of colonization and genocide, because they're very much between a rock and a hard place. So in other words, for about 600 years, they succeeded in organizing amongst themselves and creating peace, and their federation still exists today, even though all of them have been colonized. That's something that in Western society has never been accomplished, right? A peace federation that has existed for so long. So let's see. Technology. Often in your typical history book, the sort of stateless part of human history barely gets a mention, and then really quickly it goes into the first states, the first empires. And the reason that we're often told that states arose is because we needed a state to organize different infrastructure projects, right? So in the Nile Valley, in Mesopotamia, we needed a state to organize irrigation and flood control and stuff like that for agriculture, because the state is a more efficient form of organization, and these are areas in which it was just necessary, it was technologically necessary. That's absolutely false. There's plenty of examples of complex irrigation works that were created by stateless societies and organized by stateless societies. One of those in East Africa, And that actually gives an interesting example because that was still stateless and in existence when the British colonized it in the 19th century, that over a very wide region, they had a complex irrigation network that was organized and maintained in a stateless, decentralized way. The British got rid of it because for them it wasn't efficient, because this was being used for people to feed themselves, which is a very horrible thing. If you're a state, you don't want people to feed themselves, you want people to always have the danger of starvation and to be fed through some kind of partially state-controlled apparatus. You want people to work, to produce something that gets sold, and in exchange they get a little bit of money which they can use to buy their food, rather than directly feeding themselves, because there's no room in the state for that closed circuit to exploit, to take taxes, and then later for private enterprise to generate profit. So they forced the people there to engage in cash crop production for sale in the international market. But then, after a while, there were major droughts, and the form of irrigation that the British had imposed with their very intelligent, superior architects and engineers failed catastrophically. It didn't work anymore, so the people who lived there reverted to the traditional decentralized system of irrigation to prevent total famine, to prevent a total collapse of their survival mechanisms. So in fact, the stateless method was more efficient. It just wasn't good for creating surplus value. It wasn't good for letting a small number of people enrich themselves. Finally, really briefly, and then after this there's just one more section. I want to talk about the societies in the highlands of New Guinea, in the uplands of the mountainous region of New Guinea. Because often people say that, well, okay, maybe anarchy could work in a primitive, simple society, but it couldn't work in a complex society. There's also a lot of racist thinking behind that. And I guess to challenge that, I specifically want to use an example that's not from what we would consider a technologically advanced society. And I'll explain why. Even though I could just pick different examples. There are examples of factory occupations. There are examples even of businesses involved in high technology production that use cooperative models and that use self-organization. And so there are plenty of examples that show that self-organization and horizontal organization still function when you're dealing with very high levels of technological complexity. But I want to talk about the societies in the highlands of New Guinea. Europeans thought that this area was uninhabited because it's very rugged terrain with very, very steep mountains, very difficult to travel. But the first time that white people flew over the area in an airplane, they realized that in fact there's millions of people living there in very dense societies. And in fact, each mountain valley constituted a different society. Often each mountain valley had a different language. In fact, this is the area on the planet with the highest linguistic diversity. I think almost a quarter of all the human languages in existence are spoken in this relatively small region of New Guinea. Another very interesting thing that they've accomplished is for about 7,000 years, they've practiced agriculture in these very, very steep valleys without destroying the soil. That's another thing that a state has never accomplished in the history of the world. No state has ever been able to practice continuous agriculture on one spot without destroying the soil, destroying the ecology, and provoking some kind of mass starvation. No state has ever accomplished that. Within this sort of complex system of agriculture and silvicultural techniques, silviculture is like the cultivation of trees, which they use in a complementary way to prevent erosion. So when you have not a flat area but a very steep area, it's even more difficult to practice agriculture because once you cut down the trees, the next time it rains, all the soil goes down the mountain and then you have no more soil to farm on. And for 7,000 years they've been able to prevent that and create a sustainable form of agriculture with many, many complex techniques which the best agricultural scientists in the West today still don't understand why they work. Right? The first Europeans who went there, they saw these things they did, and they're like, oh, that's superstition. Look at all these funny things that they do. That doesn't make any sense. Let us show you how to garden. And they quickly realized that all of these things that the native peoples that were doing had a whole lot of history, a whole lot of science behind. It's just that they didn't understand it. So in fact, they have traditionally a very high degree of technology, but it's not the technology of flashing lights and metal tools, but different techniques that. And another interesting thing about this is, usually we're told that we need homogeneity to increase efficiency. We need a common language to share ideas and to coordinate. But we're dealing with the place with the greatest linguistic diversity in the world, in which each valley was a different society, and they were able to share all of these methods across the entire area in a decentralized, horizontal way, right? Without one society dominating all of the others. That's also very important, I think. So what were not the problems? What were not the limitations in all of these different societies, which weren't anarchists, but which I think all of us can learn a lot from? It wasn't a lack of complexity. It wasn't or an inability to organize in complex ways. It wasn't technical needs like irrigation or stuff like that. The reason that the whole world isn't organized in this way, or in these ways, because each of these societies, of course, was different, is because of colonization. It's because all of these were violently interrupted and taken over by the one form of social organization which claims to be superior, which claims to be able to work universally, but really, which in the end, the only argument that it has on its side is bloody force, is its ability to exterminate and kill off other people, which I think is once again another reason why all of us should reject it completely. Because they've only been able to do this because they have support and complicity of their own populations. So because that's referring to why I think we can learn from these examples. That's another fundamental characteristic of anarchism for me, is that anarchism doesn't offer a single program. Anarchism doesn't give answers, and that's one of the basic arguments of anarchism, is that there's no such thing as a perfect society or a perfect model for society, and the very impulse to impose a model is at the root of hierarchy and authoritarianism, right? All of these other anti-capitalist movements in the West, I think they share a lot with Christianity. They have like a large part of Christian heritage because they have this idea of like the one truth, which is going to save everyone. And the only problem with revolutions is that all of these other people, they just don't realize that we have the best method. So we basically have to shoot all of you or put you in gulags and prisons so that you can finally realize that our method is the best. Anarchism doesn't do that. Some anarchists do work out proposals for how a free society could function, and others leave it more to spontaneous organization in the moment, saying that we can't predict how a future society will organize. But in both cases, anarchists put faith in people's capacity for self-organization, right? Also with the understanding that in fact every community will be different. There's no one way to be anarchist. There's no one way to organize an anarchist society. In fact, every community will have to develop a new way of organizing based on its history, based on its culture, based on its ecology, based on its specific needs, right? An anarchist world would not at all be homogeneous. And so I think for that reason, we can learn from a wide variety of other cultures that don't fit any sort of revolutionary orthodoxy, right? Finally, I want to talk about some more recent examples, which can be considered maybe partial anarchy, right? Most of us, I guess probably all of us here live in a society where the possibility of kicking out the state and having like this stateless commune, even if it only lasts for 6 months, is a very far off possibility, right? We're not dealing with the immediate prospects of being able to self-organize the totality of our lives, even if it's only in one city or one region. If anything, the greatest possibility that we have in the foreseeable future of organizing in an anarchist way are these very limited partial projects, like maybe a social center or a protest. A protest can be organized in an anarchistic way. You can organize a free store and create some example of a sort of non-quantitative exchange based on the principle of the gift economy rather than monetization or exploitation. You can organize like a collective house, a small commune, something like that. Self-organize your workplace. These are the examples that are a little bit more accessible to us in the reality that I'm guessing most of us face in our day-to-day lives. So I want to mention some of these just to also look at the problems that those face. There's the example of the factory takeover movement in Argentina in 2001, which of course is a big example, but I think it also provides some lessons for a situation in which maybe only one factory is taken over and organized by its workers rather than dozens and dozens of factories and workplaces across an entire country. But when there was the corralito, the economic collapse in Argentina in 2001, lots of capitalist businesses shut down or went bankrupt, and then the workers took them over and organized them and proved that in fact they could organize them more efficiently than the capitalist bosses had. They could make them work where the capitalist bosses couldn't. When they started running into problems with like supply, okay, we're producing things now, but what do we do with these things, and how do we get our materials? They extended their networks, and this helped the movement expand so that more workers would take over their workplaces, and they could create a network of liberated, self-organized factories and workplaces. They also organized to defend these things, because in many cases, the police came to evict them, to kick them out, because they weren't respecting private property rights. Yeah, they're just taken over these places that belonged to some capitalist entity. And that's a limitation, because as long as we're not rupturing with the basic principles of a capitalist economy, which would be production of commodities rather than responding to human needs, right? What do we make in a factory? Sometimes it's something that we need. More often than not, it's something that actually isn't very useful for sustaining human life, and maybe actually pollutes our water, pollutes our air, and ruins the health of the people who work in that factory. Other fundamentals of capitalism, the money economy, assigning everything a quantitative value. That's a fundament of exploitation. Exchange based on quantitative value rather than the logic of the gift or on the logic of sharing, of making sure that everyone's needs are met. So I'm making these criticisms of the Argentinian movement, but I think it's really important to underline that anti-capitalist movements that meet with failure are, that's really one of the best treasures that we have, right? Because most of the times our movements don't even get strong enough to fail. Most of the time we just sort of organize in this morass in which nothing changes. It seems like we never make any influence or really engage in any major battles or conflicts. And so it's really hard to learn if what we're doing is the right thing to do. So every time an anti-capitalist movement reaches a dead end, we should actually be very thankful for that, right? Because it means that since that struggle was so advanced, now we know that there's a dead end there. So we don't have to take that same path, but we can learn from it and modify what they were doing to do it in a different way. So my criticisms of the movement in Argentina, the fact that it didn't rupture with capitalism, aren't meant to be dismissive or to say that it has no value, but in fact to thank them for that experience, because it makes all of us stronger if we choose to learn from it rather than simply reproducing it. Because the fact is they weren't able to rupture with capitalism. So I guess in some instances we need to think about how to be less pragmatic. There's another example, a much worse example, the Mondragon Cooperative Complex, which arose in the Basque Country in Spain, which was a network of workers cooperatives that extended through all the different sectors of the economy. It started with just a few different cooperatives in which workers organized themselves. They made sure they had equal pay grades. They made decisions in assemblies and so forth. And then it expanded to include stores, factories, and major factories in the shipbuilding industry and in more high technological sectors, supermarkets, grocery stores, farms, etc., including thousands and thousands of different businesses. But as this experience grew, it once again reintegrated into capitalism, right? Because again, they weren't proposing a total rupture with the capitalist logic. They were basically converting themselves into their own bosses. That may sound like an empowering thing, be your own boss. That's sort of saying be your own top. It's probably it should be our last goal. Hopefully none of us will ever become our own boss. It's a horrible thing to be. And since they were trying to be competitive within a capitalist economy is always going to advantage capitalist ways of functioning. That doesn't mean that capitalist ways of functioning are more efficient, but they are more efficient at generating capital. That's what capitalism is about. They're much, much worse at meeting our own needs, at feeding ourselves, taking care of ourselves, making sure that we're not damaging our health or damaging the environment with the forms of work that we're engaging in. But you can't measure that if your ultimate criterion is making money, right? As long as our projects remain within a money economy, that's the metric that we're using to measure success and failure. Right, you can have your anarchist coffee shop, which could be really interesting. Maybe it's really positive in your city at first because it creates a place where anarchists can gather. It creates a place where you can maybe sort of reveal some of these hidden forces behind consumerism, right? When you talk about, okay, how is coffee produced? Where is it coming from? Who is making it? You know, maybe you can have like Zapatista coffee or whatever. You can let the workers there make their decisions in assemblies, learn how to organize themselves. These are all very important things, but as long as at the end of the day, you're keeping this place running by selling coffee, then that's how you measure success. This month, did we make enough money to pay rent and to pay our salaries? If not, we have to change something. And that becomes the fundamental logic that affects everything else. So maybe in the short term it's justifiable, but in the long term we have to be thinking about breaking out of that logic and opposing that logic completely. The Mondragon Complex today, you can walk into a grocery store that's into a supermarket that's part of the Mondragon Complex and notice absolutely no difference between that and any other typically capitalist supermarket. So in order to remain competitive within a capitalist economy, they over time broke with their principles. They started paying their managers more. Why? Well, you can't get a good manager or a good, technician or all these people who work in like the management level of sort of organizing the way the business runs if they're going to make $2,000 a month here and $10,000 a month, at another company. So they eventually like broke this rule about equal pay grades in order to stay competitive. It's what happens again and again and again in different examples. And the final example that I'm going to talk about, which is sort of, I guess, an example of the opposite dynamic, is from the autonomous movement. You can look at the autonomous movement across Europe. I'm going to focus on Barcelona because that's where I live, so I know a bit more about it. Here you have a network of squatted social centers, squatted houses, workshops, events, activities, and so forth. Why do I mention this? On the one hand, it's easy to dismiss, right? Because we're talking about a sort of, if we look at like the sort of high point, what can be considered like a high point of the squatters movement in Barcelona, you're looking at some strange sort of bubble, including a few thousand people who, dress really funny and like they sort of separate themselves from the rest of society and they, go to the bad, horrible crust concerts and drink a lot of alcohol and sometimes go to protests and smash things. What does that have to do with revolution? Not as much as they seem to think. And this was also a movement that was getting pacified and so forth. So that's like the non-romantic view of the squatters movement. I guess at the time that I arrived in Barcelona, like all of the anarchist squatters, anyways, were sort of involved in this process of just like whipping themselves. Which was that here you had a few thousand people who were able to meet a very large proportion of their daily needs in self-organized ways, right? They organized ways of feeding themselves and one another with largely dumpster diving or stealing, and also communal kitchens. Remind me to get back to that quick. Organizing their own culture, right? There are lots of musical groups within this scene, not only like crust punk, it doesn't matter. Actually, different genres of music. Also, people playing flamenco, actually like quite good musicians. Lots of the activities that these people were engaged in, they weren't coming from commercial capitalist enterprises. People were making it for themselves. Their relation with it was not through the commodity form. It's not like you go to the store to buy the latest disc of whatever band you like, but you go listen to your friends, or you play in your own band. There's a huge difference at the psychological level in terms of these different things. Organizing talks, informing themselves about things happening in different parts of the world, organizing counter-information and alternative media, bicycle workshops, metal workshops, carpentry workshops, fixing up houses, planting gardens, even starting workshops and steps towards the self-organization of healthcare, right? So we're talking about a couple thousand people who are taking care of the majority of their daily needs, and as a result of that, need to engage in a very, very small amount of wage labor to acquire the money to meet their other needs. Regardless of all the criticism that can be made about the self-isolation of this bubble, that's actually quite an impressive accomplishment. Some people could also say, well, the whole thing is basically founded on dumpster diving anyways, like that's how people feed themselves, so that's just, you know, people taking advantage of the, you know, the excess of capitalism, so it doesn't really count, because it's not, you know, it's not autonomous from capitalism. I think there's a lot of errors in that line of thinking. For one thing, because I would say that dumpster diving is a close parallel to one of the most common forms of non-capitalist subsistence in human history, right, which is foraging. So before we had capitalist cities just destroying the landscape, nature was abundant. Nature produced, I don't even want to use the language of production, nature created in abundance everything that we needed to survive, and people just had to go around and pick it up, or kill it and drag it home. Capitalism has, and you know, Western civilization have drastically decreased the abundance of the natural world by covering everything in concrete and asphalt. But you know, there still are things that we can just go and collect. So it's not like, you know, these movements aren't a good example because we're only, you know, relying on the excess of capitalism, because if capitalism weren't there would be other things that people could just gather. And actually, we can also think of garbage as one of the last remaining commons, right? As capitalism has advanced, it's destroyed the commons one by one. And the commons have largely been places that capitalism has not been advanced enough to capitalize on, to commercialize. In the beginning, it was pasture land, where the lords would sort of take over the most fertile land for their own, but then, you know, the pastures would be commons, and like all the peasants could, you know, graze sheep there. They could, you know, plant their own gardens there and take advantage of that. As capitalism advanced and its productive capacities advanced, for example, in the period looked at in the seminal book Whigs and Hunters, which sort of looks at how, in the case of England, how the laws were changed to criminalize commoning as a practice, criminalize like the popular use of the commons. In that time period, the commons were like wastelands or forests, right? So all of like the fertile, cultivated lands had been enclosed, had been privatized, but lots of poor people still used the forests, which were extremely important. You can gather plants and food sources there, and also before the advent of petroleum, wood was one of the primary fuel sources for the global economy. And so this was also very important for poor people, where they could gather firewood to, you know, heat their own houses and cook their food and so forth. And in that time period, like say around the 1700s, the state began privatizing these forest lands to sort of increase you know, the dependency of people to remove another commons, because at that point capitalism was gaining the productive ability to start to exploit these spaces that it considered like waste spaces or marginal spaces. And at this point, only the most advanced capitalist countries have figured out how to commercialize on garbage and have reached that level of efficiency that they can also turn garbage into a resource, into a productive resource, whether it's by collecting in a special way to recycle it, to send it to farms to sell it. I don't know about Finland, but in the Netherlands, for example, you know, the garbage has been enclosed, right? The capitalism now knows how to turn garbage into money. In Spain, for example, it hasn't advanced that far yet, so it's still one remaining commons that capitalism isn't efficient enough yet to commercialize. So it's not that our movements are weak because, you know, we're dependent on capitalism's excess to sustain ourselves, but rather capitalism hasn't fully developed enough yet to be able to destroy all the remaining commons. And it's also a good comment on the weakness of our struggles and how much we've lost if the last remaining commons is garbage. But such is the world we live in. So in that last group of examples, once again, the limit wasn't self-organization, right? The workplaces and factories in Argentina figured out how to organize themselves and efficiently engage in production. the autonomous movement in Barcelona figured out how to let people house themselves, feed themselves, create their own cultures, and meet their needs and so forth. The Mondragon Complex used self-organization to achieve capitalist growth, in fact, and there's other examples like that. The problem was, in fact, either co-optation within capitalism or marginalization. And these are really two faces of the same coin. Capitalism is always very, very happy to give us tools to meet our needs and to achieve our dreams, right? You can like there's this whole idea of like you don't have to hate your job if you do what you love, right? Find a way to get paid for doing what you love, which is a really horrible, toxic idea, sort of like being your own boss, to turn what you love into a source of profit, to find a way to generate money from that. Or the idea of like creating alternative businesses and so forth. So we're either sort of re-diverted into a capitalist logic, because capitalism is smart enough to know that if we use these tools of commercialization and monetization that it is very happy to offer us, to start our vegan restaurants, to start our cooperative businesses, to start our self-organized factories, in time we'll just reintegrate back into capitalism without changing anything in the long term. And if we refuse these tactics, these tools that capitalism offers us, then we'll sort of end up in this sort of weird, isolated bubble in which everyone has, dreadlocks and wears black clothes and listens to weird music. And so we haven't yet found out a way in the long term to navigate this tension, to rupture with the logic of capitalism, to reject, at least in the mid and the long term, the tools that capitalism offers us, and also turn this into an invitation to society at large, for more people to participate in this abandonment and this rejection of capitalism. And I think it's good to close on that note, because we definitely don't have all the answers yet. If we had the answers, then we probably wouldn't have government and capitalism. And so that's one of the questions that our struggles today have to answer. But I hope that at the very least it's clear that we don't need capitalism, we don't need the state, they need us. And if enough people can support fiercely and intelligently enough these movements for liberation, then we can organize our own lives in total freedom, without hierarchy, without exploitation, and without oppression. That in the end is the only real limit, is whether we believe in our ability to liberate ourselves, or whether we choose to continue reproducing authority and supporting authority. And that in the end is why the state has made all of these examples disappear. Because if more people knew that it was possible, then they might start actually fighting for it. But if these just remain examples, if these just remain stories on a piece of paper, then nothing will change. We'll be a little bit more educated and a little bit more cynical. These will only have any real meaning if we fight for it. So hopefully we'll see each other in the streets. But also, I don't know how long we have this room reserved until, but I'm happy to stay as long as people want to continue talking about these things. So thank you for coming, and please raise your hand or shout out or just start talking if you have questions or comments or things that you want to add, examples from your own life, things that you want to dispute, however you want to participate. Actually, I do have one more thing to add. Because capitalist businesses are in fact so inefficient, the box of books that was supposed to arrive like a week ago still hasn't arrived. So it looks like now there's only one copy left of the book. Any day now, the rest of the books should arrive. So if anyone wants to buy one, then they can find it at maybe...
Well, there will be probably some of these will for sure be passed to Muslim Learning bookshop.
And there is one book in Maccabi library also, which is in my home now.
Which is even better, because then you can read the book in a more anarchist way by not paying for it, but sharing it. And for people who like reading things on screens and don't have the money to pay for it, I'm pretty sure the whole text is on the anarchistlibrary.org, so you can get it for free there. So thanks for coming, and if you're able to stay, please stay and keep talking.